This paper takes as its premise the idea that understanding the present is an exercise in examining the past. My struggle with current events and my exploration of the past through the lens of Malvina Reynolds' music is also occurrent throughout. My first introduction to Malvina Reynolds' music was through the television show Weeds on the Showtime network. Weeds aired for 8 seasons from 2005 to 2012. As the show's opening theme, season 1 featured Little Boxes from Reynolds' 1967 album, Malvina Reynolds Sings the Truth. For each episode in seasons 2, 3, and 8, a different artist covered Little Boxes, providing a musical theme and variations across half of the show's episodes. The broad and eclectic mix of styles represented included artists such as Elvis Costello, Death Cab for Cutie, Regina Spektor, Randy Newman, Billy Bob Thornton, The Shins, Joan Baez, The Decemberists, Linkin Park, Pink Martini, Ben Folds, Steve Martin, The Womenfolk, Dierks Bentley, Amy Mann, and many others, including versions by Kate and Anna McGarrigle in French, Kinky in Spanish, and Persephone's Bees partially in Russian, for a total of 40 different versions of the song. A different but related project from my paper today examines musical details of the theme and variations created by these different versions of the song. This paper addresses another theme and variations, a topical theme and variations that is also present in the album Malvina Reynolds Sings the Truth, and shows the incredible remaining importance of this album's content 53 years later for present-day socio-political issues. There is a relevant theme and variations within the show Weeds that dwells on a narrative level and mirrors the theme and variations within Reynolds' album. Weeds begins with Nancy Botwin, the main character played by Mary Louise Parker, living in a cliché suburban community called Agrestic, a community filled with many of Reynolds' conformist little box houses. The show ends with Nancy living in a very similar community now called Regrestic. That's the primary point of Little Boxes, that there are these cookie cutter, ticky tacky, to use Reynolds' words, patterns that society falls into, particularly in suburbia, in which daily lives repeat the same activities over and over again, with the same traditional jobs, living in traditional houses with traditional families. Or worse, and more specific to this paper, repeating the same atrocities today that were already committed in the 1960s. It pokes fun at privilege, conformity, racial and cultural stereotypes, the strictures of society, and a laundry list of other robotic cliches into which society straps us into conformance. Weeds and Reynolds alike remind us that, without careful mindfulness and introspection, we get stuck in ruts and go through the motions of life, repeating benign activities and regressive atrocities alike. Indeed, beyond Little Boxes, that's actually the point to the whole album. As I reconsidered the album, I was struck by how significant all of these topics were for present day. I knew basic history, significant happenings in the late 1960s, such as the Vietnam War, the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, the Civil Rights Movement, the Summer of Love, but I wondered what else was going on in 1967. I was struck by the incredible importance of that year and the years surrounding it, how relevant the topics of 1967 remain in present day, and how significant Malvina Reynolds Sings the Truth is for today, and how much it has to say about current societal issues. This paper looks specifically at the topics of anti-intellectualism, climate change, and racism as found on Malvina Reynolds Sings the Truth, compares them across the 1960s and present day, and demonstrates how specific songs on the album speak a truth as important today as in 1967. In 1964, Richard Hofstadter was awarded his second Pulitzer Prize in nonfiction for anti-intellectualism in American life. The book documents the history and sources of anti-intellectualism as observed in the same decade of Reynolds' album. Hofstadter notes the strained relationships of intellectuals with evangelicals, a topic very present in Reynolds' album but beyond the scope of my paper today, democratic government, business and industry, and the focus and content of the education system, issues as critical in the 1960s as they are today. Indeed, not much appears to have changed. More than 50 years later, similar attacks on intellectuals abound in our society. In 2014, Tom Nichols, professor of national security affairs at the U.S. Naval War College, wrote an article in The Federalist, The Death of Expertise, which he later expanded into a full book. Nichols addresses his perceived place within society. Quote, I am, or at least I think I am, an expert. Not on everything, but in a particular arena of human knowledge, specifically social science and public policy. When I say something on those subjects, I expect that my opinion holds more weight than that of most other people. I never thought those were particularly controversial statements. As it turns out, they're plenty controversial. Today, any assertion of expertise produces an explosion of anger from certain quarters of the American public, who immediately complain that such claims are nothing more than fallacious appeals to authority, sure signs of dreadful elitism, and an obvious effort to use credentials to stifle the dialogue required by a real democracy. I fear we are witnessing the death of expertise, a Google-fueled, Wikipedia-based, blog-sodden collapse of any division between professionals and laymen, students and teachers, knowers and wanderers. In other words, between those of any achievement in an area and those with none at all. By this, I do not mean the death of actual expertise, the knowledge of specific things that sets some people apart from others in various areas. There will always be doctors, lawyers, engineers, and other specialists in various fields. Rather, what I fear has died is any acknowledgement of expertise as anything that should alter our thoughts or change the way we live. End quote. In other words, Nichols sees a decline in, if not the complete death of, the act of intellectual thought, critical thought, and the ability to change our ideas when presented with new information, as well as a decline in the value of the expertise of the intellectual herself. The COVID-19 era has revealed some similar strains of anti-intellectualism, as experts in the hard and social sciences have been purged from many government panels. Press conferences are replete with open disagreements, information disseminated between governmental leaders, and hard data provided by scientists. One of the hallmarks of science is the idea of falsifiability, codified by Karl Popper in his seminal work, The Logic of Scientific Discovery. In perhaps an over-simple description, one makes a hypothesis and then attempts to falsify that hypothesis, resulting in either the refutation or confirmation of the hypothesis. In our modern era, we have witnessed a societal shift toward the immediate refutation of any data that falsifies a given premise or option, or opinion, pardon me. Indeed, opinion has been confused with fact, introducing a watershed of new pseudo-intellectual terminology such as fake news, alternative facts, and reconstitutions of truth, parsed into your truth and my truth. In Nichols's words, quote, to reject the notion of expertise and to replace it with a sanctimonious insistence that every person has a right to his or her own opinion is silly. Worse, it's dangerous, end quote. Music journalist David Masciatra has written books of interest to this audience on John Mellencamp and Metallica. Writing more recently in Salon, Masciatra writes, quote, America has marched drunkenly into the gutter of what could be termed cultural democracy, a pathological condition in which all opinions are equal. And to argue otherwise invites accusations of snobbery, pretentiousness, and down-the-nose contempt for the forgotten man. The true villain in a cultural democracy is the intellectual. The intellectual insists on standards of evidence, reason, and logic when attempting to reach a conclusion regarding a matter of social import. She undermines the dogma of all nonsense she undermines the dogma that all nonsense is created equal, which renders her, or indeed him, unfit for participation in the increasingly masochistic rituals of liberty. Donald Trump's suggestion that perhaps we could eradicate the coronavirus by injecting a household disinfectant, a solution actual doctors and scientists were evidently too small-minded to consider, is an apotheosis of anti-intellectualism, end quote. Trump is certainly not the sole representative of this group. He is just a product and glaring representation of a long-standing tradition, and perhaps its highest ranking and most visible proponent. We now live in a world of armchair intellectuals, virologists, sociologists, climate scientists, political pundits, and just about every other topic that requires a great deal of training, reading, and gathering of observed experiential knowledge. And these practices lead to dangerous misinformation and dangerously powerful opinions and actions based on that misinformation. Anti intellectualism isn't addressed quite as explicitly as the topics of racism and climate change on the album. No one song is dedicated just to that topic. The topic of anti intellectualism does, however, run as a strong and structural undercurrent beneath the surface of how Reynolds deals with each song's sociopolitical topic. It is the anti truth against which she fights. For the brief time today, I will focus on its presentation in her best known Little Boxes. On first listen, Little Boxes seems to have an odd shade of anti intellectualism. Reynolds mocks, quote, all the people in the houses all went to the university where they were put in boxes and they came out all the same, end quote. Reynolds was highly educated, earning bachelor's and master's degrees in English from the University of California at Berkeley, and completed her PhD in 1938 with a dissertation on the 13th century Middle English poem Amos and Amalun. Hardly an anti-intellectual, Little Boxes clarifies her statement on college education, noting that it is quite easy to graduate from a university without the intellectualism that energizes progress by returning to the same suburbs of conformity with jobs that, quote, all look just the same, much like the ticky-tacky houses of suburbia. She calls out the professions of doctors, lawyers, and business executives by name, careers arguably oriented around practice more than intellectual investigation. This is an overgeneralization, sure, but certainly true of the majority, understandably so. It isn't the university and the academy or intellectualism against which Reynolds mocks. It is conformity and the mundane act of going through life with little thought to the rest of the world. And Christopher Hitchens makes a similar observation in an essay loosely about the song entitled Suburbs of Our Discontents. In 1967, the same year in which Reynolds sang The Truth, Noam Chomsky published an article, The Responsibility of Intellectuals, in the New York Review of Books, an essay against the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, views very much shared by Reynolds. Chomsky's essay is about a critique of not just the war, but also the dishonesty of its leaders at that time. In the essay, Chomsky admonishes that, quote, it is the responsibility of intellectuals to speak the truth and to expose lies, end quote. He cites a number of examples in which so-called government experts have lied in their accounts of historical details, noting, quote, it is of no particular interest that one man is quite happy to lie in behalf of a cause which he knows to be unjust, but it is significant that such events provoke so little response in the intellectual community. The facts are known to all who care to know. The press, foreign and domestic, has presented documentation to refute each falsehood as it appears, but the power of the government's propaganda apparatus is such that the citizen who does not undertake a research project on the subject can hardly hope to confront government pronouncements with fact, end quote. Chomsky's essay is about Vietnam, sure, but his observations on anti-intellectualism in the 1960s are equally revealing for current topics and arenas of discourse. Pardon me. He notes a contrast between responsible criticism on the one hand and sentimental or emotional or hysterical criticism on the other. The hysterical critics are to be identified, apparently, by their irrational refusal to accept one fundamental political axiom, namely that the United States has the right to extend its power and control without limit, insofar as it is feasible, end quote. Chomsky notes Irving Kristol's evaluation of the intellectual, specifically targeting those in the university, characterized most notably in the Vietnam era by the talk of, quote, unreasonable ideological types in the teach-in movement, who often seem to be motivated by such absurdities as simple, virtuous anti-imperialism, who deliver harangues on the power structure. and who even sometimes stoop so low as to read articles and reports from the foreign press on the American presence in Vietnam. Furthermore, these nasty types are often psychologists, mathematicians, chemists, or philosophers, just as, incidentally, those most vocal in protest in the Soviet Union are generally physicists, literary intellectuals, and others remote from the exercise of power, rather than people with Washington context who, of course, realize that had they a new good idea about Vietnam, they would get a prompt and respectful hearing in Washington. End quote. Perhaps one of the more obvious examples of anti-intellectualism, the often bizarre conflict between climate change scientists and their dissenters looms large within the sea of important current socio-political topics, and was a more important topic in Reynolds' 1967 than I personally had originally imagined. In 2015, the website Carbon Brief asked climate scientists what were the most influential papers of all time in climate change research. Their survey group was the coordinating lead authors, and review editors on the last intergovernmental panel on climate change. Each was allowed to nominate 3 papers. Notably, the winning paper was a paper from 1967, the same year of the release of Malvina Reynolds Sings the Truth. Thermal Equilibrium of the Atmosphere with a Given Distribution of Relative Humidity, published in the Journal of the Atmospheric Sciences by Syukuro Manabe and Richard T. Weatherald. Current climate scientists noted, quote, this was really the first physically sound climate model allowing accurate predictions of climate change. Its results are still valid today. Often, when I think I've done a bit of new work, I found that it had already been included in this paper, end quote. Other scientists responded, quote, the paper was the first proper computation of global warming and stratospheric cooling from enhanced greenhouse gas concentrations, including atmospheric emission and water vapor feedback, end quote. And, quote, the paper was the first to assess the magnitude of the water vapor feedback and was frequently cited for a good 20 years after it was published, end quote. 3 songs on Malvina Reynolds Sings the Truth deal directly or metaphorically with climate change. God Bless the Grass, What Have They Done to the Rain, and Bitter Rain. I will focus on God Bless the Grass today. God Bless the Grass continues the strain of anti-intellectualism that runs as an undercurrent throughout the album. It works on 2 levels. 1, a direct address of climate change and the desolation of our natural resources. And 2, a metaphorical commentary on truth, represented by the grass, and truth's ability to overcome the same propaganda systems against which both Reynolds and Chomsky railed in 1967. God Bless the Grass describes grass's incredible persistence as a living organism to overcome the infiltration of concrete structures placed above. Reynolds describes how the grass is gentle and low, with deep roots and a strong and uncompromising will to grow. She likens the grass to the truth, with its same will to live and overcome obstacles that hide it. The grass and truth alike ultimately cannot be overcome. The music of God Bless the Grass is in a minor key and more serious in style and tone than many other songs on the album. Its meter is loosely in 4, but free in its use of rubato. This rubato gives a declarative, recitative-like feel to the poetic meter, resulting in the telling of a minstrel-like ode more than a song like Little Boxes, to which we might easily find ourselves singing along. Each stanza has 4 lines and a closing additional line stating, and God bless the grass. The first 2 lines of each stanza tell a brief story about the conflict between life and its destruction, both in regard to ecosystem and truth. The 3rd and 4th line of each stanza alternate between just 2 pitches, outlining the root and 3rd of the minor tonic chord. They serve to give a moral of sorts to the story of the first 2 lines, declaring the results of the fight between grass and concrete, truth and deception, a truth for which Reynolds fought on all fronts, intellectual, climatological, and racial. The topic of racism in the U.S. is clearly not discussable on even a remotely adequate level in the remaining time I have today. The parallels between the 1960s and present day were already clear, but have recently erupted into the consciousness of even the most naive and unaware. The 1960s represented a significant era in U.S. racial relations. The 60s were framed by the 1954 U.S. Supreme Court ruling in Brown versus Board of Education, finding segregation in the public schools unconstitutional. The 60s were marred by the assassinations of Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King Jr., all who were targeted for standing up against white supremacy for their rights as human beings. Along with a long list of atrocities between the 1960s and 2020, the recent murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor might make one pause and consider whether we've made any progress at all since Malvina Reynolds' 1967. Sadly, we could create an endless list of examples of both covert and explicit racism in the U.S., but I will focus on recent incidents near my home in East Tennessee that, in addition to the murders currently in our cultural conscious, we have brought this reinvigoration of racism a little too close to home for me. At my school, the University of Tennessee, there is The Rock, a giant boulder that happens to be right in front of the music building. It is a locus of free speech and is painted almost daily with everything from advertising of campus events to spontaneous works of art to commentary on socio-political topics and current events. In the fall of 2018, neo-Nazi and white supremacist symbols and racist slurs were painted repeatedly on The Rock, just a few days after a vigil for the victims of the mass shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. As shown in the lower picture, The Rock was repainted immediately after the racist paintings were discovered the next morning. Additionally, the following spring, an unsponsored anti-Semitic and racist meeting entitled White Nationalism, Fact or Fiction, was held on campus, a measured attack on campuses across the U.S. The chancellor and dean of my college both renounced the meeting, and resources and counseling were made available across campus during that horrible time. The meeting was heavily protested across campus. Another incident in East Tennessee occurred at the Highlander Center in Newmarket, Tennessee, a mere 30 minutes from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. The Highlander Center was central to the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s, with involvement by leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks, and serves as a center for social justice work in East Tennessee today. Arsonists set fire to the center in the spring of 2019, and white supremacist symbols were found painted on the grounds, including some of the same symbols used in the massacres at two mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand, a mere few weeks before. Sadly, it seems each corner of our world could tell a similar story of violent racism in recent years. These brief instances I share today highlight the fact that racism is rampant at all levels, local, national, and international. And more than 50 years later, these incidents in East Tennessee are not divorced from Malvina Reynolds and her work in the 1960s. Malvina Reynolds was no stranger to the battle for racial equality. Her daughter Nancy told me that Malvina herself had spent some time serving at the Highlander Center here in East Tennessee, working on social and racial issues. Two songs from the album, What's Going On Down There and Battle of Maxton Field, deal explicitly with racism. In the interest of time, I will focus on Battle of Maxton Field. Following the desegregation of public schools and the Supreme Court's ruling in Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, there was a rise in hate groups, especially the Ku Klux Klan. The Battle of Hayes Pond, the same event as Reynolds' Battle of Maxton Field, they're called both, occurred between the Lumbee Indians and the KKK. There were several incidents that led up to the battle, including a KKK rally a few months prior that was disrupted by the area's NAACP chapter and the burning of a cross outside a Native American woman's house just a few nights before the battle. The Battle of Maxton Field occurred on January 18, 1958, where the Lumbee Indians outnumbered and successfully disrupted the rally. The police arrested James W. Cole, Grand Dragon of the KKK of South Carolina, the branch that was moving into North Carolina to incite violence. Cole was charged and convicted of inciting a riot. The North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources cites the battle as representing, quote, a significant change in the fight for Native identity and improved race relations. Interactions between the three major ethnic groups of Robeson County shifted as community members reevaluated long-held positions regarding their neighbors, end quote. The battle was a seminal event in Carolinian racial politics during the late 1950s. Reynolds' song is jovial and mocking in nature. In the second singing of the chorus, Reynolds seems to chuckle as she sings the lyrics. It calls on every red blood fighting man. You can almost hear her smiling as she sings, knowing the fate that awaits the KKK in her story. The song certainly celebrates the bravery of the Lumbees and the cowardice of the KKK. Malvina Reynolds sings the truth. With the words the and truth, that's a bold but worthy statement. Reynolds herself was not fond of the album's title, which was put on the album by Columbia Records, but perhaps Columbia was right. Standing with her fellow musicians of the 1960s, like Pete Seeger and Bob Dylan, Reynolds' album, and all of her music for that matter, falls solidly in a music tradition that spoke truth to power. And whether Reynolds spoke the truth to those in power or to those whom the power was oppressing, her music addressed real-life social problems rather than superficial relationships and more mundane daily happenstances. Foucault used the word poesia, which he translates as the truth. He maintains four components of the activity of speaking the truth: frankness and clarity; two, putting one's life in danger and enduring some sort of a threat or risk; three, criticism of either self or others; and four, a moral sense of duty and the unforced freedom to speak the truth. He notes both negative and positive types of truth: one, chattering or saying any or everything one has in mind without qualification; and two, a stronger type of truth in which the speaker, quote, says what is true because he knows that it is true, and he knows that it is true because it really is true, end quote. For the Greeks from whom Foucault derives this notion of truth, this sense of knowing the truth does not undergo proof through evidential experience as it might in the modern sense of the word. On the pejorative type of poesia, Foucault highlights Plato's use in the Republic, quote, where everyone has the right to address his fellow citizens and to tell them anything, even the most stupid or dangerous things for the city, end quote. This type of truth, if we can even call it that in our modern testable sense, the pejorative type resulting in the statement of stupid or dangerous things, is often the result of the declaration of alternative facts in the post-truth era. In, in addressing spoof, in addressing truth speaking, Noam Chomsky redirects this direction of interlocution, that of speaking truth toward power. As he has noted, quote, first of all, you don't have to speak truth to power because they already know it. And secondly, you don't speak truth to anybody, that's too arrogant. What you do is join with people and try to find the truth, so you listen to them and tell them what you think and so on. You try to encourage people to think for themselves. The ones you are concerned with are the victims, not the powerful. So the slogan ought to be engage with the powerless and help them, and help yourself to find the truth. It's not an easy slogan to formulate in 5 words, but I think it's the right one, end quote. Despite the unknown audience for Reynolds' truth, Foucault's powerful or Chomsky's powerless, the truth is certainly not compromised in her bold statements on societal observations. Chomsky's point is well taken and important in contextualizing Reynolds' importance in present day. Indeed, the powers that be do know the truth, and they are quite active in trying to conceal it. That is the spirit behind ideas like alternative facts and fake news. Fake news is a particularly interesting bait and switch. Reputable fact-based news sources are denounced as fake news, weakening their place as pillars of truth. Whether Reynolds spoke truth to power in Foucault's sense or truth to those repressed by that power in Chomsky's sense, she certainly spoke truth in both philosophers' definitions. She may have been too humble to approve of Columbia's chosen title for her album, but the image of her as a truth teller stands the test of time, remaining as relevant today as she was in 1967. Directly addressing important social topics such as racism and climate change, her songs speak a truth that cuts into the murky waters of post-truth politics with relevance in both general topic and specific content alike. Just as Foucault ascribed a certain internal sense of knowing the truth on the part of the truth teller, it seems unimaginable that Reynolds didn't also know that these things she sang were true. Other songs, such as What's Going On Down There, state her purpose and audience, Chomsky's audience of the powerless quite clearly. Quote, we sing you this song so you know what's true, end quote. It continues with a challenge to continue to proclaim the truth, a truth very much in line with Foucault's poesia. Quote, and you've got to take it with you everywhere you go because it's up to you, because nobody knows what's going on down there. End quote. Thank you.